Alrighty, week 10 podcast. And this week we are going to be looking into the forests around Atlanta, Georgia, because sometimes the struggle for justice isn't just about the people, it's about the land beneath our feet, the water that runs beneath it, and the systems that decide who gets to control both. And on the essay that we're going to look at first glance, you could think that it's about one protest, a movement to stop the construction of massive police training facility known as Cop City, but really it's about something bigger. It's the way racism, capitalism, and environmental destruction are intertwined, and how activists are learning to fight them together. So, what is this Stop Cop City? Well, if we look at it, Cop City is the name activists gave to an $85 million police training complex planned for Atlanta's South River Forest, one of the city's largest remaining green spaces, which supporters call it necessary for public safety. Opponents call it an act of state violence, not only because of what it would train police to do, but because of where and how it's being built. The site sits on land with a violent history. It was once a plantation, later a prison farm, both built on the exploitation of Black and Indigenous people. For activists, those histories are not just the past, they're still alive in the soil, in the polluted creeks, in the trees being cut down to make way for militarized policing. So when protesters chant "Stop Cop City," they're not just defending a forest, they're resisting a system that ties environmental destruction to racial injustice and state control. Gordon and her co-authors introduced the concept of abolition ecology. It's a way of thinking that blends abolition, the call to end prisoners, policing, and racial violence, with ecology, the study of how living things connect and depend on one another. In other words, what if the fight for liberation and the fight for the planet are actually the same fight? The authors argue that every act of environmental harm, from pipelines to deforestation to Cop City, is also a social act built on what they call racial capitalism. That's the system that turns both land and people into resources to be owned, exploited, and disposed of. So, abolition ecology asks us to imagine something radical, a world where safety isn't built through surveillance and control, but through care, connection, and shared survival. The land isn't property, the forest isn't a training ground, and the community isn't a threat to be managed. It's a living network, like an ecosystem, that has to be protected, not policed. And to make sense of all of this, the authors used a method they call rhetorical power mapping. It's a way of tracing how power actually moves across politics, land, money, and media. Think of it like pulling back the curtain to see the whole web. City councils, real estate developers, corporations, police unions, and even environmental agencies, all connected in ways that keep control concentrated in communities marginalized. But power mapping isn't just about exposing corruption, it's about reimagining solidarity. When activists map power, they also map possibility. They show how resistance itself can grow like roots through the cracks of an unjust system. The Stop Cop City movement, for instance, connects climate activists, abolitionists, indigenous land defenders, and local Black communities, people who might not always share the same language, but who share the same struggle. Another phrase they use is beyond enclosure. Enclosure means the act of fencing something in, turning shared land or shared life into private property. It's an old word going back to when European colonizers seized common lands. But today, enclosure looks like police training grounds, oil fields, and corporate farms. It's the process of separating people from the land and from each other. So to move beyond enclosure isn't just a slogan, it's a reorientation. It means seeing justice not as control but as connection. The authors write that the Stop Cop City movement reveals how environmental and racial liberation are inseparable. And that's the heart of the essay. That ecology isn't only about nature, it's about relationships. Who is allowed to live freely, who is policed, and who decides what counts as life. Of course, the movement hasn't been easy. Activists have faced arrest, intimidation, and even violence. One protester, Manuel, was shot and killed by police while defending the forest. Their death became a symbol, a reminder that standing for life can mean confronting death. But as the authors emphasize, abolition ecology is not about despair. It's about imagination. It's about seeing beyond the systems we've inherited and believing that the new worlds are already growing in the cracks of the old one. In the face of state violence and environmental collapse, these activists are planting a vision. a world where safety doesn't come from force, where justice doesn't come from punishment, and where freedom means care for each other and for Earth. If that sounds idealistic, maybe it's because we've been taught that it is. We live in a culture that treats hope as naive and cynicism as smart. But Gordon and her co-authors challenge that. They argue that the act of imagining something better is itself a form of resistance, and maybe that's the takeaway for this. That environmental activism isn't just about saving trees or fighting pollution. It's about dismantling the systems that treat both people and the nature as disposable. To power map the world, as they describe it, is to learn to see, to trace how power travels, and to decide where we might reroute it. So the big takeaway: in the forest, where the fight for justice means the fight for survival, and where every protest, every map, every route that pushes through the concrete reminds us that the earth itself is still resisting enclosure. Well, that is podcast 10. Cue the intro. Outro.